Psychological Safety and Dr. Bawa Garba. I'm Nadi Mogul. I'm the Executive Medical Director at BHR Hospitals in North East London.
And I'm Megan Joffrey, a clinical and occupational psychologist working with Edgecombe Health.
So, Dr. Bawa Garba is a senior pediatric trainee who was convicted of manslaughter and then earlier in 2018 erased from the GMC register following a series of fatal errors of judgment that she made, but actually surrounded by a system that compounded the decision making that led to the unfortunate death of a 6-year-old boy. These decisions made by the courts and then by the General Medical Council that regulates the doctors in the UK has had a profound impact on the medical profession and is why we are talking about this case in the context of psychological safety.
So, Nadeem, why do you think at this point this case of Dr. Bawa Garba and her erasure has had such a huge impact and is so controversial?
The NHS has gone through a long and sometimes very difficult journey in establishing a culture of safety, aiming to reduce error and harm that patients experience through increasingly complex care. And that journey has required a huge investment in people, including changing the way people think and behave and act. And the Dr. Bawa Garba case has almost in one fell swoop almost halted that journey with a huge impact that has rippled across the NHS, evidence not just through the media but through the medical literature and by what people are saying to each other in corridors, in emails, and even on the Twitter and Facebook platforms, all as a result of the decisions made by the law and the GMC regulator. And my concern as the medical director is this really, that this is going to have a negative impact on patients because of our focus on trying to reduce error and harm, which requires the medical profession to be very open, transparent, and engaged. And therefore, I'm really interested to understand not only how they reacted, but how we now need to react to bring back what we were trying to continue to do on the culture of safety in healthcare.
And what this seems to illustrate to me from an organizational psychology perspective is this difference between espoused theory and theory in use. And what that is simply is to say the GMC, Jeremy Hunt, hospitals, medical education espouses the idea that it's okay to be open, to talk about errors, to raise issues. It's okay to reflect on these, and it's very important that you do that. But the theory in action, exemplified by the decision from the GMC and the High Court, is that it's not okay to do that.
I think that's a very fair conclusion to draw based on the immediate reactions to the Bawa Garba case. It has been a really difficult 15-odd-year journey to go from espoused theory to theory in use. And the really positive thing is that we are still seeing evidence of theory in use, but I'm also now we are seeing the complete opposite and its impact on stopping us from continuing to be active around building a safe culture.
And for psychological safety, theory in use must match espoused theory.
Absolutely.
So another concept that I think is construct that is helpful here is this idea of the psychological contract, which is that implicit agreement that doctors have with their employers and with the GMC that they will do X in return for Y. That contract now seems to me to have been broken. I hope not irreparably, but this case seems to have broken that contract.
So I think that's absolutely right. And one way I look at the psychological contract, which is implicit between the employer, the employee, the doctor, the patient, is the construct that is trust, that is effectively between the employer-employee, doctor-patient relationship. So if we accept that trust is defined as integrity, competence, and benevolence, then you could conclude that doctors don't feel that there's integrity in the relationship, that they may not be trusted as a result of a sense of not being able to be open and honest about what's for them in terms of error and harm. Also that the sense that their competence might be being challenged as well, because error and harm will take place, but now they can't be open about it. And finally, there is a sense right now, because of the decisions made, a sense of a system that is malevolent towards doctors. So the psychological contract is, I think, as you describe it, broken at the moment.
Right. The give and the get are not aligned.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Another concept, and this is all the work of Amy Edmondson, who talks, we're going to be talking a lot about Amy Edmondson's work, but she has described the psychological contract as a shared belief that the team is safe for interpersonal risk-taking. And it seems to me, as an outsider, that you and many other medical directors have done a lot to encourage the sense of psychological safety through the appraisal process, asking people to reflect, be open and be honest, raise issues, and they won't be punished and blamed. But that seems also to now be under threat with what has happened with Dr. Bawa.
So what we've done, for example, in my trust, to shift the culture towards a much open one and transparent one on patient safety, is establish the Patient Safety Summit, which is actually a safe place and a safe environment for all the disciplines that are in the room to talk about a case of error and harm experienced by a patient, by the very people that were directly involved in their care. And I think that that's an example of an action we've taken that has engaged staff to build that sense of psychological safety. And now I fear that that's now at risk.
Michael West also has a definition of psychological safety, which is about the confidence in speaking out about errors, problems, and uncertainties, and the importance of feeling that as a result of speaking out, things will improve. And again, I think this case has really impacted the sense of psychological safety about owning up to things. And I wonder what you think as a medical director, how this might impact learning for doctors.
I think this is really quite key as well, because investments are being made in people and in staff to enable them to be able to change the way services are delivered. That's only effectively being done by investing in quality improvement science and in teams. So in my trust, we're working with Virginia Mason Institute to give confidence and capability to staff to learn to work together. But for that to work, it requires a real sense of trust, a real sense of openness, and an opportunity to build the environments that allow the safe conversations to take place in a constructive but challenging way. My concern, though I've yet to see evidence of that in the work that's being done at the moment, that that's been put at risk, but I can see why it could be put at risk, particularly from those from the medical profession, because of the Bawa Garba case.
So again, it's this idea about doing what you say. If you say you want people to learn, you want people to be open, in actual practice, you have to do that as well. So there's going to be some repair work that you're going to have to, I imagine that medical directors and other managers are going to have to do to encourage the doctors to believe that that still needs to happen and it's still okay to raise issues.
So we'll come to the really key issue towards the end about the actions we now need to take that are proactive and need to be done with purpose to re-establish the journey of quality improvement and safe care, underpinned by building psychological safety in the individual and in the teams.
So the idea is that to be in the learning zone where you can raise issues, challenge one another, talk about mistakes, feel free to raise difficult issues without the sense of being punished, you have to have a high sense of psychological safety. And I wonder whether the Bawa Garba case has now resulted in putting people back into an anxiety zone, which you guys have worked so hard to get out of.
I think that's absolutely right. You only have to read and listen to my colleagues to know that they are in the anxiety zone. You know, that 15-year journey where I would argue we were in the comfort zone, we were in the apathy zone, and we worked really hard to move people and individuals and teams into the learning zone, is now a huge risk of pulling us down into the anxiety zone. And the anxiety zone will stop people from being engaged with providing safe care and learning from error and harm.
So one of the things that Amy Edmondson talks about is what we're going to explain now, which is about how important it is that for you to feel that you won't be criticized, that you won't be diminished, you won't be humiliated by raising issues. And she says if you're concerned about being seen as ignorant, then you won't ask questions, for example. If you're concerned about being seen by your colleagues or managers as incompetent, then it's very unlikely that you'll admit to mistakes and weaknesses. If you're concerned about being seen as a negative influence in a team or in the service, you're very unlikely to offer ideas and critique other people or bring up bad news. And finally, if you're concerned about being seen as disruptive, you are likely to keep quiet. Because you don't want to be seen as intrusive, because people will call you out as being a negative and disruptive individual, and so you are unlikely to ask for feedback, information, and help. All these things result in no change, in a lack of learning, and because there is no safe interpersonal environment.
So, from a medical senior medical perspective, I think this is really, really important and actually quite difficult for some of my colleagues, which is, you train for years, you build an expertise, and it becomes, I would argue, understandably to a point, difficult to reveal ignorance, incompetence, certainly not wishing to be seen negative or disruptive. But it's really, really incumbent on what I would call the clinical leaders, the day-to-day consultants in the NHS, to really think hard about how not to stay in that left column and be really working through, and we'll come to this, but what you now need to do is way of thinking, behaving and narrating differently so that you are no longer in that defensive column, which then allows those around you to actually be much more engaged and feel safe, to not keep the patient safe by keeping you safe.
Right. So basically, what are the actions that you need to take to get people out of the anxiety zone and back into the learning zone?
Exactly right. So now that we're going to come to what I would say are clear actions that are incumbent on the individual, teams, and the organization to support. So we want to go from what we've described, which is concepts, theory, and the reality of the journey, and the impact of the Bawa Garba case on today's medical profession, to the actions we need to take to make the difference. So to make psychological safety real,
I think one of the first things you have to do is that you've got to frame things, and you've got to create a narrative and a culture where when things happen, it's about learning, not necessarily you made a mistake, judgment, and it's an execution problem, and lay it at the floor of a person. Obviously, there has to be just blame. But if everybody feels blamed and threatened, then no one's going to learn. So if you talk about these things as learning issues, how do you think you can do that in practice?
So again, I'm not laying this all on the feet of the consultants, but they are the most senior individuals in the medical profession, leading teams every day in theatres, in wards and care environments. But it's also about the training doctors and what I call the trust grade doctors, who must also be open to this whole idea of starting their day, starting their session, starting their work by framing the moment as not just an action that needs to take place, but thinking it through as a learning environment that you're in because you're part of a team delivering care. But you've got to be really clear that your purpose is learning. The purpose and meaning of your work is learning and to provide safe care. But if you don't narrate that the work you're doing is highly complex, complex, and that with it comes risk, and therefore with it error and harm, then the silence between individuals is where the risk then becomes real in terms of the outcomes. And psychological safety is silenced in that silence, whereas thinking, behaving, and actually actively narrating that, which I've just shared with you, allows people to feel as though permission's been given to actually now engage in a psychologically safe relationship.
The second thing Amy Edmondson talks about is that it's really important for individuals, especially senior individuals who are the role models, to acknowledge their own fallibility. How can that happen in practice?
There's a lot that's been written about this and also presented on this, but it is about accepting the human condition, that we are, no matter how well trained we are, how senior we might be, how much experience we might have, we are fallible. Fallible as individual human beings providing care, but we work in systems that can potentially expose that fallibility and result in fatal outcomes, as happened with Dr. Bawa Garba and the 6-year-old boy. So it is about being honest about the fact that you haven't got the eyes at the back of your head, that actually you are going to need the support of the people around you when you're about to put knife to skin, for example. It is about the spirit of the WHO checklist, which isn't about the ticking of the boxes, but about building that psychologically safe environment in theatre, for example, but it can be in any care facility that engages your colleagues, your teams in all the different disciplines to recognize that we're all fallible, but we are safer together to keep the patient safe rather than stay silent. So I sometimes use the reverse of the 3 monkeys. If you don't look, you won't see. If you don't listen, you won't hear. And if you don't speak out, you won't be heard. That's really quite key in that narration and behavior that we are talking about.
The third thing is to model curiosity, to kind of ask why, but not in a judgmental way, and ask lots and lots of questions.
I think that's right. Actually, we've added the source of one of my favorite books from Agushan, The Humble Inquiry. I think it's a really small and powerful little book which describes the importance of how you approach your relationships with your colleagues, which is genuinely about asking questions and inviting them into a discourse, a dialogue that then allows the confidence of the building of the trusting relationship through which psychological safety has a chance of becoming established in that moment or in that session of care.
And the final one is how you encourage people to bring you the bad news.
Well, so as a medical director, I can honestly say that receiving bad news is a very frequent occurrence, but that's the nature of the job. It's not that I welcome bad news. I think it's not, it's not nice to hear that a member of staff is in trouble or that a patient is in difficulty, but it's important that we encourage that the news is brought, and that it's important that I and my colleagues sometimes have to work quite hard to ensure that how we think, behave, and narrate that conversation that follows is fundamentally about encouraging a sense of safety in that relationship, to allow more and more of that sharing to happen so that we can learn and prevent future error and harm. It is hard work. It is very easy for people to immediately pass judgment when somebody comes to you with bad news. You can't do that. You have a duty to the person that's bringing you the news and a duty to all the colleagues looking after the patient to understand the issues in the round. And as Bawa Garba case is illustrated, as much as she made some fatal errors of judgment, the system around her contributed and unfortunately effectively enabled the fatal outcome that led to the death of the 6-year-old boy. And we've got to be honest and say that it is very rare for doctors to deliberately, by omission or commission, cause harm. It is almost in the vast majority that it is as a result of a series of errors that have come together. But we will lose the learning if we don't build psychological safety in the relationship, in the individuals, and the teams, and then in the organization.
In your culture.
And therefore, culture. Absolutely. So if you wish to contact us, these are our Twitter handles, and thank you for listening.
Thank you.